Hello, I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this is the story of what happened to Flatwoods. While I typically cover both the in-game and real-world histories of these locations, I've already covered the real-world history of Flatwoods in my video on Sutton, as they lie just over 5 miles apart in Braxton County, West Virginia. That being said, we'll start with the in-game layout of the town, and then move on to the town in the real world. We'll then move to the history of the town in the Fallout universe. Flatwoods in the Fallout universe is located on the crossroads of some smaller highways, namely 86B and 88B. The town is laid out primarily in a north to south orientation, centered on Highway 86B, locally known as Church Street, a street that can also be found in the real world. The other named street in-game is Bridge Street, the local name for Highway 88B, but that street does not exist in the real world, as the bridge over Church Street for which it's known is non-existent in the real world. In the real world, Flatwoods is laid out in a primarily northeast to southwest orientation along Flatwoods Corner Road. The other main highway through town is US Route 19, running concurrently with West Virginia Route 9 through the area. US 19 runs all the way from the shores of Lake Erie and Erie, Pennsylvania in the north, to the shore of the Gulf of Mexico and Memphis, Florida to the south. The third important road running through the area in the real world is Interstate 79, running north to south west of town, ending in Erie, Pennsylvania to the north, and Charleston, West Virginia in the south. To the east of Flatwoods in-game, Interstate Highway 59 can be found, running from Charleston in the south to near Grafton in the north, while the real-world I-59 highway runs from Slidell, Louisiana to Wildwood, Georgia. While there is a river running through Flatwoods in-game, in the real world, Flatwoods lies near the head of creeks that drain into the Elk River, but they originate to the east and southeast of the main part of town. The river in-game might represent the Elk River, which flows through Sutton in the real world, or the Gauley River, when considering that the Gauley Mine is nearby, although the Gauley River in real-world West Virginia lies way south of the area, flowing to Lake Somerville and beyond. The presence of the New River Gorge Bridge nearby means that this is the New River riverbed, which by 2103 is empty, meaning that the course of the New River, ironically named as it's one of the oldest rivers on Earth, has drastically changed. The New River Gorge is also far to the south of the area in the real world though, meeting with the Gauley River to form the Kanawha River upstream from Charleston. The town of Gauley Bridge, lying approximately 49 miles south-southwest of Flatwoods, is built at the junction of these two rivers. The New River Gorge Bridge also has an interesting fact to consider, numerically speaking, in that it was completed October 22nd, 1977, which means that it was 100 years and 1 day old on the day of the bombs. A minor thing to note here too is that while the bridge is painted in the Fallout universe, the real-world bridge is made from core tin steel. This is a type of steel that's meant to rust, as that exterior layer of rust provides protection against further weathering. Along with these differences, as discussed in the video on Sutton, real-world Flatwoods has a rail line running through it, while in-game this line is absent. With the comparisons complete, let's look at the in-game town now. Flatwoods in the Fallout universe has 15 homes, apartments, 2 mobile homes, a campsite, a garage, a dry cleaner, a cafe, a gun shop, a general store, a Red Rocket gas station, the Vault-Tec Agricultural Research Center, a motel, a tavern, a church with an attached graveyard, a funeral home, and several community gardens. Let's look at the nearby sites as the last thing we do before examining the lore. Starting in the west down the New River and down Highway 86, we can find the comically named Sunshine Meadows Industrial Farm. This workshop site provides access to deposits of junk, aluminum, concrete, fertilizer, and it provides packaged food to operators who restore power to the site. Up the hill to the west of Flatwoods, one can find Broadcast Tower EMB127, likely the first site players will use to access the automated government aid drops. On this same hill overlooking the area is the Flatwoods Lookout. Traveling north from Flatwoods on Highway 86B, we can find an unmarked Blood Eagles checkpoint in the road, the Overseer's Camp, and the newly arrived Wayward, where Duchess serves up drinks. There's a covered bridge neighboring the Wayward, and while I found several covered bridges in real-world West Virginia, I couldn't find one close to Flatwoods. Up the hill to the east of Flatwoods lies the ghoul-infested New River Gorge Resort, also mentioned in my video on Sutton, as it lies between the two towns. Now that we've got the layout of the town, let's get into the lore. As a preface to this section, I want to tell you that as much as I possibly can, I will rely on the available lore sources, and there are a lot of them, but to a certain extent I will have to make some educated guesses. And after I run through the story of what happened to Flatwoods, you can watch the video that I'm putting together on the exact way that I made these jumps. That being said, let's get started. In the years before the war, Flatwoods was a quiet town in a farming region of West Virginia, like the neighboring town of Sutton. Flatwoods was divorced from the anti-automation protests and riots that plagued the cities to the north and to the south. In the local church, Reverend Delbert Winters held services for the faithful, Following the purchase of the Morgantown campus of West Virginia University in 2031, the Vault-Tec Corporation constructed and operated the Vault-Tec Agricultural Research Center. This site served as an experimental farm where technicians worked to create a robotic agricultural workforce of Mr. Farmhands, a variant of the General Atomics Mr. Handy robots. People came from nearby towns to witness the engineering feats accomplished here, the future overseer of Vault 76 among them. On Saturday, October 23, 2077, at approximately 9:47 a.m. local time, the peaceful lives of the people of Flatwoods came to an end as the seemingly eternally distant conflict between the United States and the Communist Chinese came home in a wave of nuclear fire. People raced through town attempting to reach the safety of a Vault-Tec vault or any available shelter. A truck hauling hay through town took a wrong turn and ended up parked on top of the bridge over Church Street, the driver unsure of what to do. In the gym of the Green Country Lodge, an English coffin salesman from Ipswich, Suffolk, had been performing his morning workout routine when the bombs came down. He subsequently died on the bench press, presumably killed by dropping the barbell in shock. In the pool of the same lodge, a guest who accepted their fate grabbed a beer and floated out of the pool in an inner tube, determined to leave the world in the most comfortable fashion he could. At the Vault-Tec Agricultural Research Center, the electromagnetic pulse fried the computer mainframe and shut down the local power supply, leaving the site dormant. Reverend Winters, a veteran of that war that had come home to his doorstep, and a profoundly devout man, watched the flashes of light and prepared for his final judgment. As it turned out, though, the world wasn't ending. This wasn't the prophesied Armageddon that the Reverend had believed it to be. Rather, it was the start of a new world. The skies darkened with ash that began to powder the countryside with radioactive fallout. The air cooled, and the survivors that remained in Flatwoods settled in for a long, cold winter. Through the nuclear winter of 2077 to 2078, Reverend Winters questioned his faith, confused by this turn of events. He had expected the rapture, but as the snow melted away, the world was still there. One day, as he was questioning his place in life, he watched survivors attempting to eat a raw rat. These people, born in the world before the bombs, had either lost their knowledge of cooking or had never obtained it in the first place. Reverend Winters guided these poor people through the process, and in doing so, he found a new meaning in his life. While before the bombs, he had fed people's spirits. After the bombs, he would fill their stomachs. In these early days, he met a young survivor, a boy named Colonel. Before the bombs, Colonel was the troublemaking child of an emotionally abusive single parent. When Reverend Winters took Colonel in, his father's maltreatment had led him to believe that it was singularly his bad actions that had led to the bombs. Reverend Winters gave him a place to sleep in the bell tower of the church and helped to provide him with emotional stability by writing letters to his absent father. Reverend Winters grew uneasy with his relationship with the Lord again as he witnessed the local cows give birth to the first mutated calves, these two-headed, red-skinned animals known after the bombs as Brahmin. As an additional source of protein, he would end up also hunting the mutated deer that became known as a radstag. On one such hunting and foraging trip near the Morgantown airport, he encountered a group of visitors from the Capitol in Charleston, paramedics and firefighters who called themselves the Responders. Reverend Winters greeted these newcomers and offered them the use of his church, and before too long, the Responders maintained a small outpost in town. As the Responders expanded their reach across the region, Flatwoods slowly slipped into a new normal. Reverend Winters offered cooking classes and grief counseling sessions. He set up potluck dinners, and he did what he could to help those around him. Outside of Flatwoods, the world grew more violent. In the mountains to the east, the former pharmaceutical executive and corporate raider David Thorpe had become a literal raider in the harsh cold of winter. Thorpe's raiders were attacking the Responders and making off with their food and supplies. The Responders of Charleston fought back, but the guerrilla tactics of the raiders made it hard to target them. In Flatwoods, Reverend Winters noted that some in town had left to go join these raiders in the mountains. Even this new conflict between the raiders of Pleasant Valley and the Responders of Charleston would settle into its own new normal, as people of Appalachia did what people do, and got used to the world. The Responders soon made contact with two other factions, the Free States and the Brotherhood of Steel. Before the war, the Free States had preached that the incompetence of the American government would lead to its nuclear annihilation, a sentiment that had yielded outrage and scorn from their neighbors. When the end came, the Free Staters had already retreated to their bunkers, emerging in June of 2079 to assist the people of the fallen city of Harpers Ferry with reconstruction. The Brotherhood of Steel, or more accurately, the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, had its roots in the Army Ranger group Taggarty's Thunder. Lieutenant Elizabeth Taggarty had reformed her unit under the guidance of her old friend, Army Captain Roger Maxson, first elder of the Californian Brotherhood of Steel. Soon, the Responders were running caravans over the mountains to Harpers Ferry and were cooperating with the Brotherhood on defensive operations. Like the old world, though, this new normal would also come to an end. Raider leader David Thorpe's pre-war mistress turned post-war girlfriend, Rosalind Jeffries, attempted an assault on Charleston on Christmas Eve 2082. The city had, for the first time since the war, installed Christmas lights and was able to dish out an extra ration for its people. In their assault, Jeffries' team killed several Responders, but she was wounded and captured. Those raiders who escaped returned to David Thorpe with premature word of Rosalind's death. In his sorrow and fury over her death, Thorpe took a mini-nuke stolen from the Brotherhood of Steel, and in the early morning hours of Christmas Day 2082, he destroyed the Somersville Dam that lay just above Charleston, unleashing the waters of Lake Somersville on the city. The event nearly wiped out the responders as hundreds drowned in the floodwaters. The remnants of the responders in Charleston gathered and made for Morgantown as quickly as they could. Among these survivors was the future head of the responders' outpost in Flatwoods, Dasa Ben-Ami. Before the bombs, Dasa Ben-Ami had been a PhD student of anthropology at Vaultec University in Morgantown. On the morning of the bombs, she'd been printing her doctoral thesis when the siren started. She rushed to get her brother and her father, a Vaultec employee, into the vault, volunteering to stay outside as her father had only been able to secure 2 spots in the vault. With her family safe, she went home to Charleston, narrowly avoiding the carnage of the house war that would envelop Morgantown. She joined the responders when they formed, survived the flood, and made it to Morgantown Airport with her fellow refugees. In prior years, Dasa Ben-Ami had visited Morgantown with other responders, and she'd been one of those responders who had first met with Reverend Delbert Winters. While hunting for rabbits in the woods, she also met Miguel Caldera in his forested camp. Before the bombs, Miguel Caldera had been a programmer who had found work with the United States Space Agency, the Fallout Universe NASA equivalent, and Vaultec. Miguel was a quality programmer, but his true love was for the outdoors. After the bombs, he had become a hermit in the woods, having reprogrammed a Protectron to watch over him as he slept. When presented with the opportunity to help others, he joined the responders. Once the responders were established in the Morgantown airport, Miguel and Dasa were assigned to the outpost in Flatwoods. Flatwoods became the training ground for new responders, and Dasa made it her goal to produce the best trained volunteers she could. Dasa Ben-Ami was also an archivist of sorts, seeking to preserve knowledge from people around her. She recorded a series of interviews called Survivor Stories to prevent the further loss of unrecorded knowledge, both personal and functional. In a visit to Flatwoods before the flood, she had recorded an interview with Colonel, the orphaned 13-year-old child Delbert had taken in. Her first interview on functional knowledge was with Kesha McDermott, a former high school science teacher. Kesha had been in Watoga setting up a statewide science fair when the bombs came down. She had hunkered down with a couple of high school-age survivors through the chaos in the winter before they made their trek over the mountains in the spring. Once in Charleston, she joined the responders to help them purify water properly. Dasa had been attempting to break into a soda machine when Kesha introduced herself and taught her how to properly purify water. In Flatwoods, Dasa also met Scott Shepard. A nurse by profession, Scott was an avid conspiracy theorist. According to the recording he made for Dasa to preserve his story, on Wednesday, October 13, 2077, at approximately 2:47 p.m., he was grilling burgers in his backyard. It was at this precise moment that his dog had charged into the bushes to attack an unknown visitor. When the dog returned, Scott found mossy green skin in his mouth. Proof, Scott believed, that it was an alien in the bushes. 235 hours later, the bombs came down. 235 being the atomic number for uranium. The aliens knew. But nut bars weren't the only other people Dasa Ben-Ami interviewed. In 2085, an old woman by the name of Willie Mae came into Flatwoods, and Dasa recorded an interview with her too. In September 2077, Willie Mae, a grandmother and the wife of an abusive minor, won the Watoga Times Atomic Lottery, and had what was supposed to be 10 years of preserved food delivered to her. On October 1st, 2077, a vein of ultracite erupted in the heart of the mining town of Welch, throwing the town into chaos. Atomic Mining Services, the creator of the ultracite vein, showed up to claim the land it had burst through, causing all-out riots in the region. With all the madness in the mining area, Willie Mae's husband never came home. When the bombs came down, she barricaded herself in her home. Though she wasn't able to get into one herself, she was thankful that at least some of her family had made it into the vaults. She spent the next 8 years eating her prize food that ran out 2 years early, but as she said in Dasa's recording, who is she going to complain to? She heard the responders' broadcast, left home, and hiked to Flatwoods. As a side note, Dasa may have been stealing the holotapes for the survivor stories, as the responders in the Morgantown airport noted a disappearance of the holotapes and announced a new policy of only loaning holotapes while locking the rest of them in storage. By 2086, things were finally stabilizing again after the disaster that was the Christmas flood of 2082. After a nearly 4-year fight against the super mutants that had inexplicably emerged in the mountains near Huntersville, the responders and the Brotherhood had finally brought the fighting to a close. It was at this point of hope that Harper's Ferry suddenly collapsed. Not knowing what had destroyed the town, the responders' leadership dispatched Derek J. Castle to ascertain the truth. Derek found that it had been attacked by a creature that had come from the sky and laid waste to it. Apparently, this attack even caused those who were harmed to be transformed and to fight alongside the creature. The Free States members had retreated to their bunkers to try to find some solution to this new threat. The next 10 years were only going to grow more difficult for the responders. In Flatwoods, Kesha McDermott devised a water monitoring system to track the contamination of the local water systems. Colonel, having joined the responders at age 13, assisted her in this effort, gathering samples and testing them in the church's laboratory. It seems that for a time, Responders Quartermaster Jeff Nakamura resided in Flatwoods too. It was here that he recorded the radio broadcast for the camp signal, and it was here that he received a message from Maria Chavez asking him to recon Gali mine for dynamite. Jeff Nakamura eventually relocated to the more busy post of the airport. Miguel Caldera created the Responders Volunteer Training Program, automating the process of bringing new Responders volunteers on board to reduce the workload on human workers. Miguel split his time between Flatwoods and the Morgantown airport, working to create better automated systems on both ends. When he got the chance, he would visit Gary Wilkins, a Responders courier he'd fallen in love with, who was stationed in Flatwoods. When he got time off from building automated systems in Morgantown, he'd work on his true passion, survival training. In the Flatwoods Tavern, Miguel Caldera and Reverend Delbert Winters worked on a food storage and dispensing system that generally created headaches for them both. Reverend Winters continued to teach cooking classes and help create community gardens around the town, while performing grief counseling sessions in the local funeral home turned meeting hall. Though he found it within himself to forgive his father, Colonel worked to never repeat his mistakes. At 18 years old, he became a full responder and became a caretaker to the children, doing whatever he could to ensure that they never had the bad experience that he had. As the 2080s turned to the 2090s, things continued to worsen regarding the threat that had destroyed Harper's Ferry. The Brotherhood of Steel was fighting like mad to contain the threat in the Cranberry Bog, but it was costing them food, medicine, and ammunition that they couldn't replace while keeping the monsters at bay. The Brotherhood had been demanding supplies to fight to protect the rest of Appalachia since the early 2080s, but their demands were becoming more and more urgent. Maria Chavez, the head of the responders, didn't recognize the severity of the threat, and she began to balk at the Brotherhood's demands. She reasoned that even if these scorched, as they were called, were a threat, the responders needed the supplies to protect their people too. That far-off threat became more real as the scorched began to appear in the toxic valley to the north. The scorched could infect anyone they got too close to with a scorched plague, a death sentence that ended with conversion to more scorched. To combat this threat, the responders dispatched the fire breathers, their hazardous conditions forces, to hold the line wherever they could. In April of 2093, as the demand for supplies was increasing, a man by the name of McFadden arrived at the Vaultec Agricultural Research Center, intent on restoring it to working order. In July, the responders provided him with a fusion core that brought the center back online, but the computers were still fried, and the Mr. Farmhands were lifeless husks. Not being a technician, McFadden spent the next 5 months bringing a single Mr. Farmhand online by January 1st, 2094. On that day, he related to his log that the responders had lost a battle near Grafton. The scorched were inching into the northern end of responders' territory. On June 12, 2094, McFadden reported to his log that he had finally brought all the Mr. Farmhands online, but they were still all idling. Outside the research center, McFadden had a wife and children. He received a distressing letter from them that said that the scorched had been spotted near his family farm, and that all the men had gone off to Morgantown. McFadden refused to answer the call to come home. He had to get the center back online. On November 11th, 2094, having lost contact with the outside world, McFadden tried a Hail Mary pass in altering the code that ran the Mr. Farmhands. In this act, he sealed his own fate, activating the Mr. Farmhands and causing them to view humans as a precursor material to fertilizer. He was killed almost immediately, and the site became hostile to outside interference. The responders from Flatwoods managed to only stop the robots from targeting humans. They never managed to get them to properly work on their task. And the solution unfortunately has to be applied every so often to keep the Mr. Farmhands in check. In August of 2095, a disturbing message was broadcast over the mountains. Defiance has fallen. The Brotherhood was suddenly gone. They had failed in their last-ditch attempt to end the threat of the scorched, and the enormous bats known as scorched beasts now flew freely out of the Cranberry Bog. More and more refugees flooded into Flatwoods all the time, and more responders were required to defend the Morgantown airport from the growing threat. Among this new wave of refugees lurked a more dangerous breed of human, the Raiders. As the scorched and their winged masters spread out, many raiders saw the writing on the wall, and while David Thorpe and his hardcore cutthroats held the line, many others deserted and fled to the west. Even among those raiders, there were those who were more harmful and those who were more benign. Tabitha, an addict and likely a former member of the Die Hard Raider gang, claimed to Dasa that she was coming out of a drug-induced haze for the first time in years, having no recollection of her life before. Despite this claim, she still knew enough to tell Dasa to avoid the mountains. One of the more dangerous Raider refugees was Sophie Yates. Sophie had wandered into Flatwoods in January of 2096 and had joined a Reverend Winters cooking course. Despite the influx of refugees, by mid-June, Dasa had to leave Flatwoods to assist at the airport, leaving Reverend Delbert Winters and Kesha McDermott in charge, while Colonel stayed behind to tend to the children. Having survived horrible conditions as a child in the aftermath of the bombs, Sophie was jaded about life and cynical about the responders' ability to help people. She made up her mind to get back to the mountains. On July 24th, as she was planning to leave, Reverend Winters tried to stop her. She murdered him in cold blood. She then returned to the house she'd been living in Flatwoods and recorded a final mocking survivor story, then committed suicide. Strangely, there's a body of a man named Buzz Yates that once lay in the church infirmary. Was this a relative of Sophie Yates? Could his death have been the trigger that caused her to distrust the responders' capabilities? Regardless, the day after Sophie's murder-suicide, an ambitious volunteer candidate named Cullen McLeader arrived in Flatwoods, looking to do some good. Cullen wasn't the first visitor to be logged by the automated system that started logging patients after the responders left from Morgantown, though. Mikey Eddles and Chris Balthazar arrived on June 15th and July 18th respectively. Chris Balthazar died less than 24 hours after arrival, leaving Mikey Eddles to bury him and then presumably leave the site. Cullen McLeader, though, had not come for help, but to help. Over the coming weeks, Cullen worked through the volunteer training program and waited for the responders to come back from wherever they'd gone. More refugees arrived, including Mike Scholler. Mike was possibly a former Free Stater, as he claimed to have fled a bunker. Mike then traded some supplies and headed off to Fort Defiance, seemingly hoping to assist the already fallen Brotherhood of Steel. On August 14, 2096, Dr. Adam Vinn arrived in Flatwoods. Unfortunately for the wounded and ailing, Dr. Vinn was a doctor of philosophy, not a medical doctor. When the doctor arrived in Flatwoods, he was complaining of having the shakes after eating nothing but heavily processed food, not just for the nearly 19 years since the bombs, but for many years prior to that. Like Cullen, though, Dr. Vinn hung around to help out the responders, working to restock local supplies. On August 25th, the proprietor of the Moonshiner Shack near Vault 76, Brad Hooper, arrived in town after his home was swarmed by giant bugs. On September 1st, Dr. Vinn left a final log saying that Cullen had completed the volunteer training program and found an emergency message that alerted them to the fact that the responders had been recalled to Morgantown to fight a besieging army of the Scorched. For unknown reasons, it took the two of them 81 days to get to the airport. At that time, though, the sky was darkening as the sun was being blocked out by swarming scorched beasts. Miguel Caldera's significant other, Gary Wilkins, was killed by the Scorched. After Gary's burial, Miguel retreated back into the woods from which he had emerged to help the responders. He died there a broken man. When Cullen McLeader and Dr. Vinn arrived on November 20th, 2096, the responders were already dead. It appears that the fall of Flatwoods came not at the hands of the Scorched, but at the hands of raiders. By late October to early November 2096, the responders were very near collapse. Outposts across Appalachia had fallen. Whether the responders of Point Pleasant or the responders of Flatwoods were the last to go, we don't know. But at the very least, we do know that by November 2096, the Flatwoods Tavern was still operating, albeit operating on shorter supply. As the inn neared, Flatwoods resident Jeremiah Ward's granddaughter Mia disappeared. When Mr. Ward approached the responders looking for help, they told him wild dogs must have killed his granddaughter. He didn't believe it, though. He'd seen suspicious people in the hills outside of town, watching them. He was sure that the raiders had kidnapped Mia. He gathered his supplies, wrote a will, and cooked a meal as preparation for his final mission. But sadly, he never got to carry out his plans, as the town was hit at just that time. Unbeknownst to Mr. Ward, an addict of a raider had recently come into Flatwoods after robbing her fellow raiders. Those raiders tracked her to Flatwoods and assaulted the town. Willie Mae and Scott Shepard were killed on their own front porches. Cashin McDermott was struck down while testing the water quality at the river. Colonel gave his life defending his charges against the attack. In the tavern, the raiders locked a responder into the fridge and left him to die. They didn't manage to take revenge on the thief that had led them there, though, as she overdosed on the other side of the river, watching the events unfold. Dasa Ben-Ami appears to have managed to flee the carnage at the airport and return to Flatwoods. It may be that she was killed in this attack, or that she died of wounds sustained in the battle at the airport. But she was the last of the original responders to check in the automated system on November 5th, 2096. The closing days of the scorching of Appalachia were chaotic and are sometimes difficult to parse. For example, Kesha McDermott signed into the system for the last time on October 25th, 2096. She should have been able to tell Cullen McLeader and the other refugees who arrived in Flatwoods where the responders had gone. Why didn't she? Why didn't anyone tend to Reverend Winter's body in his trailer? Why did it take over 2 months for Cullen McLeader to reach the Morgantown airport? Regardless, by the dawning of 2097, Flatwoods was a ghost town that would not see another unscorched human until the overseer of Vault 76 arrived on October 22nd, 2102. She found the remnants of the responders and investigated the Vault-Tec Agricultural Research Center before heading to Sutton and later on to Morgantown. From July 2096 to November of the same year, responder Dr. Claire Hudson had been working on an inoculation for the Scorched Plague. When she couldn't complete it because of the entire breakdown of the responders' logistical network, she abandoned her work to die alongside her friends at the Morgantown airport. In 2102, the residents of Vault 76 managed to complete her work and went on to seriously neuter the threat of the Scorched by annihilating their queen. In the aftermath of these events, settlers and raiders have returned to Appalachia. Flatwoods, as of 2103, is home to a new responder, Heather Ellis. Heather arrived in the region with the settlers of Foundation before making her way down to Flatwoods. She admires the responders for who they were and strives to live by their ideals. I believe she is the one responsible for moving the bodies of Dasa Ben Ami and Buzz Yates out of the infirmary and into the graveyard. The town is now also home to a handful of other settlers, wanderers, and scavengers who are either attempting to extract useful resources from Flatwoods, or alternatively to use those resources to build up Flatwoods. I think that will do it for the story of Flatwoods. If you're interested in how I arrived at the narrative I've detailed, feel free to check out the second video I released today detailing my efforts to parse the lore and speculation on other matters encountered here. If you want notifications on when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. Should you appreciate what I do and desire to assist me financially, I've created a Patreon account and I'll link it in the description of this video and in the About section for this channel. This has been the Resolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.